1992, and Professor Hameroff suggested that the microtubules were a good candidate for a quantum mechanism in the brain. Sir Penrose was interested in the mathematical features of the microtubule lattice, and over the next 2 years, the two collaborated in formulating the orchestrated objective reduction or OR model of consciousness. Over the years since 1994, Professor Hameroff has been active in promoting the orchestrated OR model of consciousness through his website, conferences, and lectures. He was the lead organizer of the first Tucson Consciousness meeting in 1994 that brought together over 300 people interested in consciousness studies, including David Chalmers, Christopher Koch, Barnard Bars, Roger Penrose, and Benjamin Libet. This conference is widely regarded as a landmark event within the field of consciousness studies, and by bringing researchers from various disciplines together, led to various useful synergies, resulting in the formation of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona, of which Professor Hameroff is now the director. The Center for Consciousness Studies hosts meetings on the study of consciousness every 2 years, as well as sponsors seminars on consciousness theory. Professor Hameroff is the Emeritus Chair from the West of the TSC 2016 East-West Forum.
Thank you, Vishal. Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the origin of life in terms of consciousness. Chris, you may recognize this talk. Okay. So Darwin's theory of evolution, or at least the neo-Darwinian approach, as it's been modified, of natural selection by random mutation is a pillar of science. It suggests that consciousness is an afterthought, an epiphenomenon that occurred due to biological evolution. But it fails to account for the origin of life. There's a long time between the first living systems and genes. And also the motivation for selfish genes, what Richard Dawkins has called selfish genes, the idea that the purpose of life is to promote genes per se. In other words, reproductive success. Why a gene or an organism would do that without any feelings seems a bit odd to me, especially because number 3, behavior is driven by dopaminergic reward. That is a need for pleasure or relief, mediated, for example, by the neurotransmitter dopamine, and pleasure, hedonism, or Freud's pleasure principle. Freud had the idea that our actions were guided to seek pleasure or avoid pain, but also altruism. It feels better to give than to receive, and of course, spiritual harmony. To be in harmony and enlightened and spiritual feels good. We could argue whether that in and of itself is separate, but it's still a feeling, and I think that's what we all strive for. In other words, without feelings, why bother? Why would an organism fight to survive if it didn't have any feelings? It would be a philosophical zombie or a robot. If you say, well, it's programmed to do so, then you have to say, well, it's programmed by God and or something like that, and that's what intelligent design people say, but they're heavily criticized. So I think there's a problem here. So let's start with the question, what is life? There are several ways to describe what life is. Functional approaches, for example, that of Lynn Margulis Sagan, which describes its functions in terms of self-organization, metabolism, growth, adaptation, response to stimuli, replication, reproduction, and evolution. These are all functions, but these occur in computer programs, video games, and weather patterns. In fact, this picture is of a weather pattern on Jupiter, which has been stable for many, many decades. There's nothing specific about being alive. Now, in the 19th century, people had the idea of vitalism, that there was a life force, a unifying energy field, or élan vital, pervading living systems. But this was based either on electromagnetism, which didn't work for various reasons, or on forces outside science. Vitalism became taboo, unscientific. It was basically thrown out of science. Other people take the approach that life involves some kind of self-organization, scale invariant logic, information flow, complexity, coherently pumped metabolism, emergence, self-organized criticality, systems theory, and so forth. But the problem with these as a sole description is that non-living systems can also have these properties. So we're looking for something that is unique to life. Schrödinger in 1935 suggested it was a quantum effect, quantum vitalism. In his book, What is Life?, Schrödinger suggested life's unitary oneness derived from quantum coherence, and that memory was stored in what he called aperiodic crystal lattices. And DNA came along and was thought to be such an aperiodic crystal lattice. Of course, microtubules are also. But critics said biology is too warm, wet, and noisy for functional effects in delicate quantum systems. Or is it? It was because of this worry, because quantum computers have to be built at absolute zero, that people didn't consider quantum biology seriously until fairly recently. About 10 years ago, it was discovered that plants use quantum coherence in photosynthesis to make energy and food. So energy is collected here, photons from the sun, in the light harvesting complex in all plants, and transferred through this FMO protein to a reaction center where the energy is converted to food, sugar, for example, that can be eaten by animals. And it turns out that the photons are converted to electronic excitations, which propagate through these chromophores, which are complexes of aromatic rings of pi resonance electron clouds. And it turns out that the energy, the excitons, propagate through all of these simultaneously in superposition to get to the reaction center. And this allows very efficient conversion of sunlight to food, without which we might not be alive. And in fact, people building solar cells are trying to copy this mechanism. So this allows food to be made from sunlight for plants and animals and for us. Now, a number of scientists have thought that quantum effects might be in this the same pi resonance that's seen in the plants in a quantum state in all living systems, and actually define life itself. So, for example, Szent-Györgyi, who won a Nobel Prize for something else, said the essence of life is in a submolecular electron mobility. Electrons, for example, in pi resonance groups within molecules. The Russians, Philip and Albert Pullman, attributed life to quantum behavior of electrons in pi resonance clouds. And Herbert Froelich, whom I had the pleasure of meeting in the 80s, said that life was in coherent electron dipoles in nonpolar regions in geometrically constrained proteins. You needed some kind of lattice so they could be coordinated. He referred to membrane proteins, but I asked him about cytoskeleton microtubules, and he agreed they were good candidates, and indeed they are, for what's now known as Froelich Coherence. Occurred a moment of conscious experience, Bing, would occur, so that a self-collapse occurred, and that produced consciousness. So using an emoji, the idea is that could produce a pleasant sensation, and these selections would not be random, but influenced by Platonic values in the structure of space-time geometry. In other words, conscious perceptions and choices could be influenced by factors intrinsic to the universe. Now, it's possible that feeling good is preferred because it resonates, it feels good, but because it resonates with the deeper level structure of the universe in kind of a hierarchical system, such as we heard this morning. And that would occur because they would resonate with these Platonic values in the structure of space-time geometry. So the idea here is that consciousness is really resonating with deeper levels of the universe. Now, most of these experiences would be random and meaningless because they weren't connected, like notes and tones of an orchestra warming up. So you might imagine that these types of self-collapses and moments of conscious experience are occurring everywhere, in the lectern, in the air, but they don't connect and they don't add up to anything, and there's no memory. Like an orchestra warming up where you hear all the different instruments playing individual notes, it's not really music, it's just noise and sound. What we want is a mechanism for the orchestra to begin playing, for music to occur out of random notes and tones. And that's what I think life does and what the brain does, is to orchestrate these objective reduction events and turn them into something like music. And I think consciousness is more like music than a computation. Now, this mechanism, although a lot of people criticize it, it is, I believe, the only mechanism for conscious experience ever proposed. We hear things about emergence and complexity, but this is actually the only actual mechanism, specific mechanism, due to self-collapse of the wave function due to a specific equation ever proposed, and it's also testable. So the idea would be that the Bing of the redness of a rose, in the classical view, on the top would be due to a pattern of activity in her brain, but in this view would be a pattern in the basic structure of space-time geometry, many more than 3 curvatures, but the idea that the essence, the qualia of the red rose, would occur in the space-time geometry inside the observer's head. So that's how we get qualia out of the universe. But how would this occur in the warm, wet, and noisy biological brain? Everybody said that that's impossible. I mentioned the photosynthesis by these pi resonance oscillations, and I think the mechanism in the brain and in biology in general is very similar. Now, from chemistry, we know that organic chemistry is based on benzene rings, 6-sided rings, which are carbon-based rings. And chemists in the 18th century knew that there were alkanes and alkenes that were basically linear chains, but then they had C6H6, which was flammable and oily, and they didn't know the structure. And then Kekulé, a German chemist, had a dream that the other alkanes and alkenes were like snakes, and one snake swallowed its tail, and that's called the Ouroboros. And he woke up and said, aha, benzene is a ring. The snake had swallowed his tail, and he turned out to be exactly right. Now, there are 3 extra electrons in benzene, and they oscillate and actually delocalize. And this is the key point, that the extra electrons form an electron cloud, which is non-local, which is electron cloud pi resonance quantum state. The electron is not in any one place. It's smeared out and shared over this whole area. And then when you get more of these together, then they can share among more than one ring. Now, we know these rings process quantum spin in this experiment in 2003, where quantum spin through benzene rings connecting quantum dots was actually increased by temperature. So in this case, temperature is not the enemy of quantum states, but actually is utilized to drive the coherence when you have these organic molecules like benzene. Also, it's known that these pi electron resonance clouds couple by quantum dipole forces, and they come together, they attract each other to just the right distance, called the van der Waals radius. And once there, the electron cloud dipoles oscillate back and forth. And this oscillation is in about 10 to the 12th hertz, terahertz, which is pretty fast compared to biologicals, but it's actually not so fast compared to some biological systems. It's also known that these pi resonance rings have only a few stable arrangements, the sandwich, the T-shaped, and the parallel displaced. That's the only way they'll sit comfortably. And the S, the sandwich, may be metastable, leaving only T and P as alternate possibilities. So maybe what happens is that when self-collapse occurs to a particular configuration, that results in specific feelings. In the course of evolution, biology might have worked to put the pi stacks in the proper geometry to optimize feelings. Now, in tubulin, the protein of microtubules, there are 86 aromatic rings. And in the red spheres, you see where anesthetics bind. And if all the rings were in the had relations to their neighbors, that would leave a lot of possibilities for not only information but feelings if particular geometries of the pi stack rings correlated with specific feelings. And so this is kind of a joke, but in one tubulin, you could have many, many types of feelings, many, many complex interrelations, using the emoji example. So the basic idea is that in a microtubule, we have dipoles along the Fibonacci geometry, and these dipoles oscillate back and forth in terahertz. And we know from some other work that anesthesia, which takes away consciousness reversibly, sparing non-conscious activities, that anesthesia seems to disperse and prevent these dipoles. And some work Travis Craddock and Jack Tuszynski and I have been doing seems to show that this is true for all anesthetics, and we're pursuing that very, very keenly. And this is the work of Anirban Bandyapati, who spoke earlier, and basically it shows that if you take take neurons at the top here, 2 neurons, and you go down in scale to a single microtubule, and then to tubulins within a microtubule, you go from the largest scale, very slow, hertz, then kilohertz, then megahertz, getting faster and faster, then kilohertz, megahertz, and gigahertz at the level of microtubules, and at the level of tubulin, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz, the frequency at which the benzene rings oscillate. And it should also be noted that all psychoactive molecules, all the neurotransmitters which affect mood and drugs which affect consciousness, like psychedelic drugs, are all rich in these aromatic rings and pi resonance rings. So pi resonance rings often have they're nonpolar, but they have polar tails forming what are called amphipathic molecules. And oil and water don't mix. So when you mix these together, the pi resonance clouds in the aromatic rings self-assemble. And for example, an oil slick over a water puddle that stays away from the water. And these self-assemble in protein folding, forming what are called nonpolar hydrophobic pockets inside proteins. They also form what are called micelles. And we know that it's the hydrophobic pockets inside proteins where anesthesia acts. And the same thing happens in lipid bilayers with a nonpolar hydrophobic core, and in nucleic acids in DNA and RNA. The central core is all pi resonance, which means there can be quantum effects occurring there. So there's a quantum underground pervading all living systems. So if you look at a cell, a lot of it's water, and we know about the water, but if you look at the biomolecules and look inside them, you find a quantum core, more or less, a nonpolar region that we're calling the quantum underground. And we have a chapter on that coming, the quantum underground where life originates and consciousness. And the pi stack and DNA would be susceptible to objective reduction and Platonic influences in gene mutation and evolution. So Platonic values embedded in the universe itself, can influence not only our conscious perceptions, but perhaps our evolution by altering gene mutation in DNA. But how did life originate and evolve before genes? There was a long time before, in biosystems, before we even got to genes. So another way to ask this question is, which came first, consciousness or life? And the first view, that neuroscience view, is that life preceded consciousness, and consciousness emerged from life. But in other views, including the Eastern view, consciousness preceded life, and life emerged from consciousness. Now, how is that possible? Well, life on Earth apparently began in what's called a primordial soup, a mixture of various types of molecules 3 to 4 billion years ago. In the 1950s, two scientists, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, simulated a primordial soup and found organic amphipathic biomolecules. So they had all the chemicals that were there, they simulated the atmosphere, they put an electric spark in to simulate lightning, and they found the same amphipathic organic molecules that were predicted, and with a nonpolar end and a polar end. So these are amphipathic molecules. And they look a lot like dopamine, the mood molecule or the reward molecule that gives rise to feelings. And these would self-assemble and then begin to oscillate back and forth and do a form of quantum computing, including and going into superposition, and then collapse from to one or the other state. So it could be that back in the primordial soup, billions and billions of years ago, these primitive micelles, which were like primitive proteins, with many, many more than just three, reached a threshold for self-collapse by the Penrose mechanism, which was actually happening at the level of space-time geometry, and a primitive proto-conscious moment occurred. And this is followed by many, many more. And now most of these would be random, but some of them would be pleasurable. So the question is, did primitive pleasure spark the origin of life? Consciousness already in the universe that was pleasurable caused these molecules to provide feedback, to orient the pi stacks in the right way, to grow and get larger, have more and more intense conscious pleasure. Now, these would initially be random and proto-conscious, but some would be positive and feel good, and this could have led to evolution evolving towards optimizing pleasure. Did life evolve to feel good? I think it might have. And in this chapter I've written, which is coming out soon in a book on human nature, I propose that quantum, the consciousness or pleasure in the previously in the universe prompted the origin of life to optimize pleasure, and excuse me. That life originated and then evolved to feel good. Now, it's true that microtubules. Hang on a second. I'll call you right back. I'm going to talk, okay? Sorry about that. Microtubules seem able to attract and harness virtually all kinds of energy, electromagnetic, photons, even perhaps gravitational waves. And centrioles and cilia are larger and can be waveguides for resonators. And so the basic idea here is that we have a hierarchy of frequencies going from very big on the left for EEG frequency, like a few hertz, and then going smaller and smaller into the microtubules. We go to microtubule bundles, microtubules, tubular pathways, and then down to the pi cloud dipoles inside tubulin. And so we have this hierarchy, and I think consciousness can move up and down this hierarchy. And if you meditate or you're enlightened, you're going to move to a deeper level, and it's possible even to be in space-time geometry without biology, so that consciousness could be independent of life. And as you go this way, you become more into the material world and the classical world. So in conclusion, I would say that based on Penrose objective reduction, consciousness preceded life and sparked its origin. Life and the brain evolved to feel good, to optimize pleasure, hedonism, altruism, spiritual harmony, through resonance with the structure of space-time geometry. Microtubules appeared to integrate all forms of energy and orchestrate random feelings or qualia into full, rich, conscious experience. And in consideration of the anthropic principle, the idea that the universe and all its physical constants are perfectly tuned to support life and consciousness, and if consciousness is intrinsic to the universe, then it could be that the universe itself may be evolving to optimize consciousness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.